So I'm pleased to present today's speaker, Dr. Kathryn Morgan. She is the Joan Palevsky Professor of Classics at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research interests range broadly over Greek literature of the 5th and 4th centuries BC, from Pindar, Greek lyric, and Attic tragedy to Plato and Isocrates. Recent articles and chapters have focused on Simonides and the Sophists, as well as Platonic narratology and metaphor. Her 2015 book, Pindar and the Construction of Syracusan Monarchy in the 5th century BC, examined tyrannical representation in Pindar's victory odes for Hieron of Syracuse. But her current projects are returning her to Plato and his relationship with the important genres of Attic comedy and historiography, and reflect her ongoing involvement in the series Studies in Ancient Greek Narrative, published by Brill, where she is responsible for the chapters covering Plato. I hope you'll all enjoy today's presentation from Dr. Morgan.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks to all of you for being here, and to the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies for arranging this visit. I'm so pleased to be here. For most students of the ancient world, Plato is known for his theory of forms and his banishment of most poetry from the ideal state that he sketches in his Republic. There, Socrates takes issue with the exemplary status of the narratives of Greek poetry. We shouldn't be telling our young people stories that have the gods or heroes doing unacceptable things. Towards the end of that dialogue, Socrates critiques the psychological effects of mimesis, representation. When we watch a hero on the tragic stage lamenting, we engage emotionally with the character and we feel pleasure, but this strengthens the emotional, appetitive aspect of the soul that we should be keeping under the control of reason. The Greek poetic performance tradition was characterized by affective engagement. But as Harvey Eunice remarks, so long as the audience are experiencing the events vicariously, they don't consciously seek to understand what the poet means by the texts he composes. What I want to do today is examine how Plato explores this type of affective engagement in a different context, that of historical narrative, an area where he is perhaps an unrecognized intellectual pioneer. I want to suggest to you that Plato is the creator, or at least for the ancient Greeks, of what we might call the historical imagination, and that the way he has his characters deploy this imagination shows him moving towards a new vision of engagement with the past, one that highlights the role of rational reconstruction of the past and puts it to positive philosophical purposes. We're going to see it at work in his dialogue Menexenus, as the patriotic rhetoric of the Athenian funeral oration offers new opportunities for assessment of the past, and also in the laws, as sentimental attitudes to historical tradition are reworked to create a vision of ethically informed historical research. I'm going to start with the Ion, however, to remind us how classical Greek audiences might have reacted to poetic narrative. And then I'm going to move on to the Menexenus, the Timaeus, and the Laws. In these three dialogues, oral prose narratives are both constructed and theorized for their emotional effects. To begin then with the Ion. Now, this dialogue is not about history in our sense, but we need to keep in mind that for the classical Greeks, heroic myth did not necessarily exist in a separate conceptual space from more recent events. There was a continuum between the time of myth and the time of history. The action of the dialogue represents Socrates taking down a professional reciter of Homeric poetry who has intellectual pretensions. But there's a particular moment that I want to focus on. Socrates wants to prove that Ion doesn't interpret Homer on the basis of knowledge, but by a kind of inspiration. When Ion astounds his audience in his recitations, Socrates asks, and this is your handout 1A, is he in his right mind? Surely, Socrates says, he is outside himself, possessed by the god. His soul thinks it is actually at the events he speaks about. And Ion agrees. This is your handout 1B. When he tells a pitiful story, his eyes fill with tears. When he tells a terrible one, his hair stands on end and his heart pounds. This picture fits well with the notion of affective engagement I've just described. And it happens not only for the performer, but for the audience as well. This is your handout 1C. Ion humorously comments that as he recites, he looks at his audience and observes them weeping or in astonishment. I have to pay close attention, he says to them, since if I let them sit down weeping, I shall laugh as I take their money. But if I set them down laughing, I myself shall cry and lose my money. Now, this is the moment that interests me. In her commentary on the passage, Penelope Murray notes that the paradox of Ion being in control of his faculties while still being transported is not as inconceivable as it sounds if we think in terms of theatrical performance. A good performer will pay attention to the effect of his or her performance, even as he or she inhabits the world represented. He or she will manipulate the affect of the audience. Now, this is a seminal observation. The goal of the manipulation for Ion is, in the first instance, increased engagement and thus the acquisition of money. The performer here has no intellectual, still less a philosophical purpose. But it's the combination of engagement with evaluation that's significant for me here. We have a collaborative enterprise of imaginative projection with a purpose, even though in the Ion, the collaboration is only in terms of emotional engagement. The more objective evaluation of the emotional dynamic belongs to the performer alone. Now, my next step comes with the Menexenus. This is an astonishing dialogue, whose focus is the tradition of the Athenian funeral oration, a speech honoring the war dead and given with some regularity during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. The most famous example is Pericles' funeral oration, as reported in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. The oration praised the dead and the city for which they had died, and urged those left behind to emulate their sacrifice. So much for the tradition. In the Menexenus, Socrates has a conversation with a young man, Menexenus, who himself has ambitions to deliver this oration. He quotes to him, as an example of the genre, a speech which he says was composed by Aspasia, Pericles' famous mistress. Scholarly opinion has been divided for decades on how to interpret this speech. For some, it's a representation of the power of philosophy to transform Athenian public rhetoric. For others, myself included, it's a parody, though not without a serious purpose, an expose of the intellectually bankrupt nature of Athenian public rhetoric. Now, this is not, of course, an issue that we're going to solve today, but again, I want to focus on one particular point. Part of the tradition of the oration was to relate the glorious deeds performed by the city, stretching along the continuum that ran from the mythical past down into the more recent past. Socrates, ventriloquizing Aspasia, says that as he does this part of the genre, he's going to pass over the events that have already been celebrated by poets and concentrate on those that have not yet received such elaboration. And he starts with the Persian Wars of the early 5th century BCE. This is your handout number 2. The ancestors, he says, of the current dead checked the Persians, and he must praise their excellence, because this is what you do in a speech like this. He says, quote, indeed, if someone is going to praise it finely, that's their excellence, he must look at it having put himself through discourse, logos, in that time when all of Asia was enslaved to the third king, and he means the third Persian king of the Achaemenid dynasty. In the few sentences that follow, the speaker sketches the history of the Persian Empire and the lead up to the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Not only was there political enslavement by the Persians, but mental bondage. The minds of all people, Socrates says, were enslaved. By the time the Battle of Marathon was imminent, and this is the beginning of your handout number 3, none of the Greeks were willing to help the Athenians. They were all terrified. Our speaker then closes the narrative ring he opened previously. This is continuing in your handout 3. Someone who was in this situation could recognize what sort of men they were in respect to excellence, who received the power of the barbarians at Marathon. And in fact, we go on to learn, they became teachers to the rest of the Greeks that the Persians were not unbeatable. Now, this is a fascinating passage. As the speaker portrays the relentless march of Persian expansion, the horizons of other peoples become narrower. Their minds are paralyzed. They are ekpeplegmenoi, thunderstruck by the advancing enemy. In contrast to this lethargy stands the active resistance of the Athenians of the time, but also the present audience, which is invited to time travel, to project themselves through the power of speech through that time so that they can correctly assess the excellence of their ancestors. They too can be thunderstruck. And this word is the same word, ekpeplegmenoi, as Plato used to describe the reactions of Ion's audience to his recitation. But the putative Socratic audience, of course, has the advantage of hindsight. The paralytic terror of the rest of the Greeks and the Athenians' withstanding of the Persian attack can coexist in their imagination, so that the contrast between the paralysis of the rest of the Greeks and the activity of the Athenians is a measure of the greatness of Athens' achievement. And in fact, it's only the possibility of historical projection that allows for proper praise. We have to see the excellence of the ancestors in its proper historical context, surrounded by the ambient emotions of the time. In order to understand, we have to juxtapose the terror and the isolation with their bravery. Now, this is a significant moment, though a complicated one. I don't know of any text from previous centuries, and I would be interested to see whether any of you can give me some, right, that connects praise with historical projection in quite this way. And it should be clear that we're not merely dealing with exemplarity. It's not just a matter of saying our ancestors did a great deed and so we must follow their example. Rather, we're told that the quality of praise is tied to the nature of our historical understanding. And that understanding is not just political, but emotional. And in contrast to the Ion, we have a different kind of compact between speaker and audience. In the Ion, the performer maintains a paradoxical state of distancing and engagement, manipulating the emotions of the audience while himself experiencing those same emotions. In the Monexenus, however, even though the experience of the audience is being orchestrated by the orator, he's not encouraging them to lose themselves in the narrative, but to join in his own project. Remember that the speaker represents himself as laying out material that hasn't yet received full poetic treatment. He and his audience must engage in historical projection in order to understand what happened, and this understanding can then receive future poetic elaboration. There's a groundbreaking kind of literary triage going on here. The rhetorical enterprise is made prior to poetry. And so the dynamic of the funeral oration takes precedence over anything that might come after. The relationship of the oration with rival genres had always been fraught. In Pericles' funeral oration in Thucydides, to which Plato is certainly looking here, Pericles asserts that the power of Athens requires no Homer to sing its praises, nor any other, quote, whose verses will charm for the moment and whose claims the factual truth will destroy, end quote. That's Latimer's translation. Pericles emphasizes that Athenian achievement supersedes poetic elaboration, even though he's more severe than Socrates in claiming that no Homer is needed at all. The community of orator and audience in the Menexenus must experience the affective environment of the past, but do so with an eye to its implications for the present, both in terms of present and future discourse and present emotion. They must remain critical and self-aware, and the result won't be financial gain, as in the Ion, but civic solidarity. This dynamic is, for Plato, a double-edged sword, I think. Let's look first at the negative side, one that we would associate with a parodic approach to this dialogue. The vision of classical Athens presented in the Menexenus is, as many have pointed out, historically inaccurate and prejudiced. There's no real mention of the Athenian Empire, and the hostility of the rest of the Greeks towards Athens is explained merely in terms of jealousy. Yet, as Trevino observes, the funeral oration regularly misrepresented Athenian history, and we can't conclude from the mere presence of historical inaccuracies that Socrates' speech contains parodic distortion. But cumulatively, I think, we do get an impression of a bridge too far, and particularly when we think of the oration in terms of Plato's critique elsewhere of effective engagement and manipulative rhetoric. At the beginning of the dialogue, and this is handout 4, during his conversation with Menexenus, Socrates reports how, when he hears a funeral oration, he is, quote, bewitched and, quote, beside himself or transported. So effective are such speeches that it takes him, he says, 3 or 4 days to recover from them. And until then, he thinks he's living on the islands of the blessed. Socrates' description of his reaction is reminiscent of the dynamic between Ion and his audience. This doesn't really sound like critical engagement, and indeed, it recalls the criticism that Plato makes of rhetoric in dialogues like the Gorgias, where he assimilates rhetoric to flattery. The purported author of the speech that Socrates delivers is, as I've said, Aspasia, who is supposed to have cobbled it together from the leftover bits of the previous speeches that she composed for Pericles, the most famous orator of the mid-5th century. Precisely to the extent that we read the oration as Aspasian, we should beware of its sultry charms. The speech may assert that Athens has acted justly, but it doesn't define what justice is. That's very unphilosophical. It's rather a communal patriotic fantasy, and all the sophistication that I've just been explicating could be seen as a specious intellectualization of existing civic rhetoric. That wouldn't make the presentation of historical projection in the Menexenus any less innovative, it wouldn't make it any less interesting, but it would mean that we shouldn't think of historical projection as an intrinsically philosophical tool. Like most rhetorical techniques, it's value neutral and takes its ethical coloring from the use to which it's put. More positively, however, we might see traces of philosophical potential in historical projection as it's presented in the Menexenus. While it's true that historical projection could be a rhetorical tool, the awareness involved in such an act of imagination could be harnessed to philosophical ends. The combination of critical reflection and imaginative reconstruction, the consideration of what people must have felt and what effect their emotions might have had on their actions, is conducive to thoughtful evaluation. Here we might well think of another aspect of Plato's philosophy connected in the Republic to the way mimesis or representation works, and that's the divided soul. At the beginning of this talk, I sketched how in the Republic, indulging in emotion strengthens the appetitive part of the soul. And this is part of a wider picture wherein the human soul has three parts: reason, which should be in control, appetite or desire, and spirit, the part of us that gets angry. When Socrates criticizes the perils of mimesis in the Republic, he's clear that it's a mimesis of bad people that he's worried about. It would be fine to identify emotionally with a brave soldier dying on behalf of the city. You might say then that what's going on in the Menexenus is merely a riff on the potential of positive mimesis. But this would be to miss the intellectual component that's present, whereby we don't just imitate, but project ourselves in order to evaluate. Reason plays an important part. And recall too, that when the Socratic funeral orator does his little dance around the idea of historical projection, he doesn't merely say, put yourself in the place of those who fought at Marathon so that you can emulate their courage. He says, this was handout 2 again, put yourself in a historical situation where you're aware of the details of the rise of the Persian Empire, of the Persian attack on Eretria, and the catastrophic defeat of that city, of the failure of any Greek city except for the Spartans to help Athens. Then you'll realize the nature of Athenian excellence. Socrates wants the audience of his oration to reconstruct an entire historical context. It's not a philosophical analysis, it's not even really a historical analysis, but it begins to show how we might proceed if this is what we wanted to do. And this brings us to my next exhibit, which is the Timaeus. I'm going to treat it briefly because it's part of my larger concern, namely, why would a thinker like Plato, so famous for his utopian thinking, be interested in history in the first place? In the Republic, the only thing he has to say about historical narrative is this. When he's talking about falseness in words and the reasons that this comes about, he observes, and this is your handout number 5, that when we're dealing with narrative about the past, because we don't know what the truth is about ancient matters, we liken the false to the true as much as possible and so make it useful. This clearly conceives narrative as having purely exemplary and didactic function. And indeed, in the Republic, the way Socrates uses myth is didactic, it's not research-oriented. But here we encounter an interesting development in Plato's body of work. We can't really tell the order of the dialogues, but we do have reason to believe that his laws came last, and that the Timaeus is also a late dialogue. And in these dialogues, Plato seems to have become more interested in history. In the Timaeus, there's the maddeningly elusive story of Athens and Atlantis. And in Laws Book 3, we get a sketch of the history of the Dorian cities of the Peloponnese, Athens, and the Persian Empire. Christopher Gill rightly suggests that in the later part of his writing career, Plato's interest in history and in prehistory increased. Now, this is too large a phenomenon to consider in detail here, but what's important for my present purposes is something Socrates says at the beginning of the Timaeus. As this dialogue opens, the speakers look back to the discussion they've had that was similar to the discussion of the Republic concerning the creation of an ideal state. Socrates declares, and this is your handout number 6, that he's dissatisfied with that past conversation. He says, listen to what happened next when it came to the constitution we described, what I experienced with regard to it. I thought the experience was something like this, as if one had seen somewhere beautiful animals, whether created through drawing or really alive but at rest, and then one conceived a desire to see them moving and engaged in some contest fitting for their bodies. I experienced the same thing with regard to the city we described, for I would listen with pleasure to someone narrating an account of the contests in which the city struggled. So it is that Socrates prepares the way for the strange history of Athens and Atlantis, a story that everybody in the dialogue agrees is absolutely true and has been, it's said, preserved in Egyptian archives for millennia. This story is supposed to transfer the utopian state of the Republic into the real world. Now, there are those who are suspicious of the philosophical credentials of the Atlantis history, but I'm more interested in the emotional trajectory that leads Socrates to want such a story in the first place. He found a utopian narrative emotionally unsatisfying. He wants to see the city in narrative motion. He conceived a desire to do so, and I've bolded this phrase in the Greek so that you can see that the word for desire is epithumia, appetite, the phenomenon that gives a name in the Republic to the appetitive part of the soul that had to be kept under control. This is a significant moment. At various points in the Republic, Socrates had insisted it made no difference whether his ideal state had ever existed or would ever exist. But this is not how he feels now. Now he wants to engage. We should note that in this elevated conversation, we can engage emotionally with the deeds of the city because it's a virtuous city. Engagement with the victory of ancient Athens over the imperial aggression of Atlantis is permissible because ancient Athens transfers the details of Socrates' utopian state into the real world. Now, I'm not claiming that we're dealing with historical projection here in the same way as in the Menexenus. Indeed, the projection is going on in a different direction from the world of the ideal into the world of history. I do claim, however, that this moment marks an understanding that engagement with a narrative that can properly be termed historical is desirable even in a philosophical discussion. The difference from the situations I've been discussing previously is the nature of the audience. In the Ion and Menexenus, we're dealing with professional or quasi-professional performance and a lay audience. The rhapsode who recites, in the case of the Ion, and expounds Homer to a crowd, and a politician who is chosen to address the public at a funeral, even though, in the dialogue, in fact, the oration is delivered by Socrates to Menexenus. In the Timaeus, on the other hand, we're in an intimate gathering. Socrates and three friends whom he describes as being experts in both philosophy and politics. When Socrates casts around for the right kind of narrator to create the story he has in mind, he explicitly excludes the poets because they have no proper experience of political philosophy. So it's in this sort of venue that we can admit an appeal to emotional engagement, because all the speakers and the listeners are so expert that they're unlikely to be swept away. The Timaeus, in terms of my argument today, forms a kind of transition away from the world of the Menexenus and public rhetoric. It's no accident that the conversation of that dialogue takes place at the time of the Panathenaia, the great Athenian cultural festival that was marked by athletic and musical competition, and that the Atlantis narrative has some features of Athenian festival speeches. Yet the occasion for the discussion in the Timaeus is not a public one. It prepares us for the scenario of the laws, to which I'm going to turn as my final scenario. The laws, as I've said, was probably Plato's last dialogue, and it was left unrevised at his death. It's the only dialogue not to include Socrates. It features three old men, an Athenian, a Cretan, and a Spartan, that sounds like some kind of shaggy dog story, walking to a shrine of Zeus on Crete and discussing once again different political systems. But there's a difference from Plato's previous treatments of this theme. At the beginning of Book 3 of the Laws, the Athenian stranger, who's the intellectual powerhouse of the group, encourages his companions to consider how political systems come into existence. And the starting point is, this is your handout number 7, the expanse of time and our inexperience of it, and the changes that take place in it. He proceeds to sketch a cyclic view of history in which civilizations of all kinds rise and fall, punctuated by periodic cataclysms, speculating how in each instance, simpler forms of socialization become more complex. Primitive communities pass into aristocracies or perhaps monarchies. Cities develop, and to cut a very long story short, we finally get to the Trojan War, after which, Spartan traditions say, the Dorians came to the Peloponnese and the polity of the Lacedaemonians was founded. This is the moment at which we transition to a time within the intellectual grasp of the present. And the next step, this is your handout number 8, is to ask his interlocutors to project themselves into the time when the 3 allied Dorian states were founded in the Peloponnese. Let us transport ourselves in our minds, he says, to that time when Lacedaemon and Argos and Messene and those areas subject to them had come pretty much under the control of your forefathers, Megillus. As for what followed, they resolved, as the myth says, to divide the host into 3 parts and settle the 3 cities of Argos, Messene, and Lacedaemon. The foundation of Lacedaemon is where the interlocutors can get a good grip, where mythological traditions transform themselves into useful material so that the discussion can come to grips with the issue of constitutions. Of course, the part of this that interests me is that phrase, let us transport ourselves in our minds to that time. Why does the Athenian stranger want his companions to do this? The goal is to understand what conditions make a city flourish or decline. The characters had previously suggested that when a constitution is overthrown, it's the rulers who are to blame. Now, and this is your handout number 9, they're in a position to confirm this, since they have, quote, come to the same conclusion having chanced upon actual events, so that we will not investigate the same subject in the case of something empty, kenon, but in the case of something that happened and is real. The interlocutors all agree that of the 3 Dorian kingdoms that were founded in the Peloponnese after the Trojan War, only one of them, Sparta, really succeeded, whereas the other 2 declined. I suppose the Argives wouldn't have been very pleased to hear that. Now, what could possibly have caused this? I can't focus today too much on the details of the argument made by the Athenian stranger in the pages that follow, but the short version is that the kings of Argos and Messene were young and greedy and not moderate enough, so that the great Dorian alliance fell apart. In Sparta, on the other hand, the lawgiver checked the power of the kings with other executive bodies, the Council of Elders and the Ephors, so that moderation was preserved. Now, as a reconstruction of early Iron Age Greek history, this is unlikely to be accurate. But what concerns us is the role played by the historical imagination, and this is the thread that I want to follow. In the laws, the method of transport into the past is not logos, discourse, as it was in the Menexenus, but dianoia, mind or thought. This isn't surprising, since in contrast with the Menexenus, we're no longer in a performance situation. Even though Socrates and Menexenus were engaged in a private conversation, Socrates delivered a sample performance of a funeral oration. In the laws, however, we're dealing with 3 politically experienced old men who are enjoying a gentle amble through the countryside. The Athenian stranger doesn't want to make a speech, he wants to have a discussion. So a performance dynamic is ruled out, and rhetorical techniques should be unnecessary. Historical projection is not subordinated to the task of praise, but it's part of a research project. This project is historical and political, and part of it involves investigating the role of the emotions and appetites and the virtues that should control them in context. And as we'll see, the conversation will also explore the role of emotional affect in historical investigation. The Athenian stranger proceeds by using inference anchored to the details of historical tradition in order to reconstruct the past. The three Dorian states, he says, must have made a pact of mutual support. The rulers and the ruled in each individual state agreed to respect each other's interests and abide by the laws. The alliance was also intended to defend them against foreign attack. It's likely, he says, and this is your handout number 10, that they thought that this alliance would last a long time. They were confident in the excellence of their leaders, who were the descendants of Heracles, and had been unified in the past. But their expectations were thwarted, and Sparta has been at war with the other two parts ever since. By projecting himself into the past, the stranger aims to uncover the mindset of the Dorians at this formative moment. At the same time, however, he contrasts these expectations with what actually happened, employing a kind of dual consciousness. The task is to find out the reason for historical failure, and everybody agrees that this is a really important task. The Athenian congratulates himself for zeroing in on it. But then he pulls himself short. He had observed, and this is the end of your handout 10, that if the Dorian mindset and alliance had persisted, it would have been an irresistible military force, and the history of Greece would have been very different. Now, and this is your handout 11, he asks whether they had in fact, inadvertently, done something rather trite and common among all men. Quote, thinking on each occasion that they are seeing a fine event come to pass, and one that would have had marvelous effects if somebody had understood how to make good use of it in some way. End quote. So perhaps they aren't thinking correctly or naturally, particularly since everybody does this kind of reconstruction when they, in the case of other events, when they consider them in this way. And he goes on to laugh at himself, admitting that he thought this Dorian alliance was a great thing. It was a marvelous possession for the Greeks if somebody had known how to make correct use of it. Now, this is a fascinating moment for me because the stranger is isolating the problem of counterfactual history, or we might say historical wishful thinking. It turns out that even though the Athenian stranger and his friends are doing research and aren't in a performance situation, some emotion can creep in. Here, admiration, the kind of admiration that might lead to praise, maybe also some disappointment. This danger is particularly pressing since the speakers come from three different parts of the Greek world and can be expected to have their own chauvinistic attachments to their polis traditions. This is certainly so of the Spartan and the Cretan, though the Athenian stranger seems to be exempt. Part of the challenge seems to be passing beyond polis nationalism. So they've transported themselves into the past. They see the event happening, and the Greek does use seeing verbs here, and they react to it, but they were meant to be dispassionate. It's suggestive that the speaker connects his lapse with a general human tendency to engage in counterfactual history. There are evidently two ways of engaging in such historical analysis, the common way and the way they should be doing it. We might say that in this moment, the world of the laws briefly veers towards that of the Menexenus, a world in which crowds engage in sentimental appropriation of the past, one in which we verge towards praise. But the stranger has a different end in mind. He goes on to ask, in what circumstances praise should be rightly bestowed? And he observes, this is your handout number 12, that there is one common human desire or appetite, epithumema. That is, that things turn out the way we wish. But, he makes McGillis admit, we should have these wishes only if they are supported by our rational judgment. But this, it seems, was lacking at the time. The cause, and this is your handout 13, of the disastrous collapse of the Dorian alliance was not cowardice or lack of military knowledge, but other kinds of baseness, and most importantly, ignorance or amathia. The stranger wants to show his interlocutors that this was so then, and it will be so in the future. And by ignorance, he means ignorance of what is fine and good. Past, present, and future fuse in this passage, and the world of the present investigation is mapped onto the context of the past. The Dorian states in the past wanted their alliance to last, and they expected that it would, because we all want the world to conform to our desires. But, as the Athenian goes on to show or suggest, they didn't understand the greedy nature of rulers, especially when they're young. And so the young rulers had too much power, except by good luck in Sparta. This was ignorance. In the present, on the other hand, we observe the past, and when we find something attractive in it, we wish it had lasted, because we too are misled by wishful thinking, because we risk assimilating ourselves to the hopes and expectations of the past. What we should be doing, on the other hand, is isolating a chain of ethical causation. Ignorance is the cause of mistakes in the past and incorrect historical analysis in the present. If, however, we keep our eyes on the ethical prize, we can make a useful diagnosis. Thus, and this is your handout number 14, the Athenian conclude that it's not a matter of great wisdom now to understand and say what should have happened, but if it had been possible to foresee it at the time, the person foreseer would have been wiser than they are. This whole sequence is a kind of education on the perils of facile historical analysis. We can learn then on the basis of the past, but we need to be philosophers rather than the usual kind of politician if we want to do so. We need to develop that dual focus I've been talking about, the ability to project ourselves into the past and immerse ourselves in its context, but also to keep our distance, to measure the emotional context of the past against what we know actually happened, so that we can understand, not just wish. And that understanding has to be virtue-oriented. It's important that we realize that historical understanding and historical projection is not just an end in itself in the world of the laws, but a tool for the reformation of society. As the laws continues, we'll learn that one of the interlocutors, the Cretan, has just been tasked with creating a law code for a new colony, so he'll be able to put his research to good use. The discussion of the dialogue will spend hundreds of pages, figuring out how to create laws that will make the citizens of a state truly virtuous, since only then will the state be successful in the real world. Now, this is, of course, utopian, and it's easy to mock, but I hope I've said enough to show how this project develops seamlessly out of Plato's concerns with mimesis and emotional engagement. If I'm on track here, we may be able to use this perspective to understand the way the Athenian stranger presents Athenian history towards the end of Laws Book 3. This section, although we can't linger on it, returns us to public performance and closes the circle I've been sketching from performance to the philosophical research seminar. When the stranger talks about the Persian Wars here, he shows the Athenians learning from the past. Before the Persian invasions, he says, Athens had an ancient constitution that was characterized by shame or reverence, eidos. Knowledge of the coming invasions by the Persians made them terrified, and this in turn nurtured a spirit of obedience to authority and civic solidarity. The Athenians won the Battle of Marathon, but then they heard another invasion was coming. They remembered what had happened before. This is 699b, quote, they looked to what had happened before, end quote. And the same spirit of solidarity and friendship mixed with fear helped them to victory. Now, in this case, we can't really talk about historical projection because the two Persian invasions were only 10 years apart, but it's suggestive that we're presented with a picture of a people successfully motivated by a memory of previous emotion. Of course, things went downhill after that, and Athenian decadence in the 5th century is exemplified by the way they changed their poetic culture. Rather, we are told, than looking to correctness in musical composition, they looked only to pleasure. So thus we get, right, Athenian tragedy, that dreadful corrupting experience, not to mention all the horrors of new music of the late 5th century. Pleasure, then, for them, was the only criterion by which to judge a poetic composition. And this corruption in the way they judged their music led to unrestrained democracy and fundamentally to the end of civilization as we know it. Now, it's really weird that the stranger tells the story of the 5th century by giving a history of Athenian performance culture. But we're now perhaps in a better position to see why he does so. The problem with musical democracy is that it privileges pleasurable, affective engagement and discourages us from applying the proper standards of correctness to music. We may well question whether a large audience could sustain an approach to performance that recapitulates some of the features of a graduate history seminar. But it seems clear that the developments in Athenian musical culture described by the stranger contrast the painstaking analysis and critique of Greek history that's preceded. So let me finish. I've presented an intellectual trajectory in Plato that starts with emotional identification in the world of narration, but then explores whether another mode of engagement might be possible, a bifurcated approach that has our reason assess the implications of the past for the present. Along the way, I've argued, we can see Plato pioneering and theorizing the operation of the historical imagination as he leaves utopia and enters the territory of history and applied philosophy. Thank you very much.
Well, this is wonderful, and thank you so much, especially for someone like me who delves more in Aristotle, to learn so much more about how the person against whom I think we can say Aristotle was reacting with his talk about how tragedy is more philosophical than history. It's exactly this very nicely elaborated argument that you've made and that we've, I think most of us, only been familiar with from reading The End of the Republic and not from delving into the laws in the Timaeus. So I have found this wonderfully enlightening, and how it comes back to this idea of amathia, which means that, you know, in a very Platonic way, knowledge is at the center of things. But are there others who would like to be asking? Dimitri?
So, again, as you were discussing the reflections on of the three discussions in the laws on the Doric predicament, you pointed out that you raised this idea of the reader of history as someone who creates their own sense of wishful thinking and desire the fulfillment of historical fantasy, and this is where things go wrong because there is not this reason engagement with the material. And I wonder if that kind of moment where performance and emotion might be coming into the engagement with history is not then and that critique is not then picked up by someone like Polybius when he goes against tragic history in his own work, whether the Polybian kind of attack on tragic history is actually very much this Platonic kind of moment where we can't understand it the moment it becomes a moment of desire and performance and tears and the iron kind of story.
Yes. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, interestingly, I think that one could draw like two broad trajectories, one that leads from Thucydides to Plato and down to Polybius, because remember that Thucydides also is somebody who doesn't like tomuthores, this kind of sentimental approach to historical narrative. I think Plato, and this is part of my larger project here, is picking up on certain things that are going on in Thucydides and that are then going to have a long afterlife. But parallel to this, we have somebody like Isocrates, who is very much thinking about how to manipulate the orator. And in fact, in his version of philosophy, somebody who manipulates the emotion of the crowd. And it's Isocrates' students, right? Starting with Ephorus, but then but then going on downwards, who create this notion, I think, of a more tragic style of history. But I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
And also the images that you present with earlier on with the Ionis, the kind of performance that it presents is kind of Cleone for one of the two Gracchi who's accused of slapping his toga and moving his clothes. So it's this kind of performance that is being critiqued.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So there's this is not in Thucydides. I forget where it is. Maybe you can remember, David. But this notion that it's after Pericles that Athenian oratory changes, so that Cleon, who was one of the next major influential politicians in the Peloponnesian War, is the first person who, when he speaks, doesn't keep his hands nicely tucked inside his cloak anymore, but he moves violently around and he gestures and he appeals to the emotions. And this could in fact take us back to the Mytilenean debate. Sure. in Thucydides, of course. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think you're right. The oratorical manipulation of the emotion is something that Plato really wants to theorize and combat.
Jake?
Thank you so much for this talk. I'm here. I'm ready to play with the historian. You sort of anticipated my questions a little bit, because during your talk, there were so many points which I thought, Thucydides. I mean, speaking about the combination of critical reflection and imaginative reconstruction, both with the speeches themselves of Mytilenean debate and theology, beginning with Thucydides, right? The idea that you bring up in the laws of inference anchored in historical tradition. Think about Thucydides converting wheels, and how he kind of deals with the Iron Age and Bronze Age text, even though he says, well, we can't know it. But he goes on and does it anyway. It's nice to sort of think, well, what can we do? So there are so many points at which it really felt like a lot of what you're saying is a very close conversation with Thucydides. So I wonder if you could maybe just unpack that a little bit more, or do you see Plato as being really a direct conversation with this Thucydidean idea of history, either accepting certain parts or rejecting certain parts, or is there more of a kind of general cultural kind of movement that you're seeing both of these individual authors engage with?
Okay, so the answer to that is absolutely the former. This paper is the first step in a book project that I'm going to be working on next year, which is about Plato's reading of and reception of Thucydides. And I think that this is an area that has long needed, I think, much more intense scrutiny than it's received. When one reads articles on, not that there are that many of them, on who was reading Thucydides in the early 4th century, very few people say that Plato was reading Thucydides. To me, it seems unquestionable that he is engaging very closely with Thucydides. And once you start looking for Thucydides in Plato, he starts just rising to the surface all the time. So I think he is, and there are aspects of the Thucydidean project that would have been tremendously attractive to Plato. This idea that we need to be more objective, to distance ourselves, not to get swept up by emotion. But on the other hand, he also, I think, would have he would have disagreed with the notion that by collecting the facts on the ground, we can end up with historical understanding. So I think Plato has a much more top-down understanding of historical knowledge than Thucydides does. I think Thucydides is more bottom up and Plato is more top down, and I'm interested in that space in the middle where he engages with him. But yes.
I have something very different. So I was waiting for someone else to see if they wanted to respond to that. And part of this comes from my interest in religion, just to preface this, another from my lack of engagement with Plato in many instances. But I want to come back to a comment that you made right in the first minute of your talk that really struck with me, where you talked about reflections on Socrates being sort of opposed to the gods engaging in sort of inappropriate actions. And to me, the first thing that came to my mind is how Roman that idea is. That the Romans did not develop this kind of mythology because they didn't perceive their gods as capable of engaging in these kinds of inappropriate actions. And I'm wondering if there is sort of a reception by the Romans of Plato, or if this is something that's completely Roman, or if they're engaging with Plato at all.
I bet now, so this is way out of my comfort zone, and I have colleagues that I wish were in the room to talk about this, including my colleague David Blank. So I think that yes, you could probably find this sort of thing, bubbling up in Cicero. But I'm not going to say much more than that, because I'm simply not qualified to do so. But of course, is it? I don't know anywhere in Cicero where it's clear that he is actually, engaging with Plato on these subjects. But it would be really interesting.
The second you said that my mind just made me think the Romans. So yeah, cool. I'll look into it further. Thank you.
There's also the kind of Augustine mindset where he's trying to be a morality police, and so his pious hero isn't going to have that kind of degenerate background. Yeah, and of course in the Greek tradition, Xenophanes kind of gives us a starting point for that attitude toward the gods too. We mustn't be thinking of them committing adultery. And that sort of
Yeah, and this is, this is a long, it's a long tradition that, as you say, starts with the pre-Socratics, but then you get it in Euripides too. I mean, this is one of the things that fascinates me so much about the Euripidean thought world. I mean, we might take, for example, I know this is like totally off topic, but mad Heracles, right? Great tragedy. So Heracles has finished all his labors, right? He comes home, right? He's going to live happily ever after. And then the goddess Hera drives him mad and he kills his wife and children. Well, that's a real downer. And he's, and he has stopped, and he's like thrown into unconsciousness by the goddess Athena. And then when he wakes up, he finds himself, tied to a column, right, with the bodies of his family around him. What went on? Along comes Theseus. And Theseus says to him, come to Athens, everything will be okay. But, you shouldn't feel responsible because, you didn't do this. It was the gods that made you do it. And Heracles says one of the most extraordinary things in Greek tragedy. He says, well, this has no reference to my present plight, but I don't believe that the gods do this. I don't believe that the gods commit adultery or throw each other in chains, right? If God is truly God, right, he's perfect, lacking nothing. These are the wretched lies of poets. Now, so this is like very Xenophonian, but it's extraordinary that Heracles says this in a play where we know he's wrong. He's telling it within one of these wretched poetic lies, but he is conceiving of a world outside the world of the drama, right, where this wouldn't apply. And that for me is one of the fascinating things about Euripides, how he creates this mythological world and then has his characters knock at the ceiling of that world, saying, I want to get out. I want to get out of this world. There's no way for them to do it. And that's one of the things that makes, Euripides really tragic for me.
And of course, Heracles then says, but yeah, you're right. I shouldn't commit suicide. I should accept your offer of hospitality in Athens.
Right.
So, even though you're wrong about the gods.
Yeah.
Yeah, is Herodotus the elephant in the room?
Another project would be to read Herodotus in Plato. And you could do that too. I mean, there are certain parts of the beginning of the Timaeus where it's really clear that he's engaging with Herodotus. I think that Herodotus would have been, I think Plato certainly knew Herodotus's histories. I think that he wouldn't have found them so useful because Herodotus is too broad-minded. Right? Herodotus is the person who will collect all the versions and put them side by side and say, which is why he's much more a historian for the current age, right? It's interesting over how over the past decades, right, Herodotus has become, I'm not going to say everybody's favorite historian, but we are much more appreciative now of how useful it is not to have somebody like Thucydides, right, pre-digest everything and say this is the way it was, but to have somebody like Herodotus who says, well, the Greeks say, then the Persians say, and in fact, in Sicily, they have a different version. That's really useful for us, but it's not didactic in the same way.
Although there's a sense in which it's dialectical, and Plato ought to be like that.
He should.
Just to jump in on that, I mean, do you think that the ghost of Herodotus is sort of haunting the criticism of the Aspasian type of orators, right? Because of course, Herodotus was reading philosophies out loud, entertainment about their various case of Thucydides or the also by day, but it's introductions, people who write their histories just for public applause, whereas mine is a position all the time.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
do you think that that's sort of there in this idea of the orator who gives his crowd pleasing speech to time, just the time travel? You go back in time, it's for this sort of patriotic rah-rah, or it's not philosophical. It's mostly just for the applause.
Yes,
You know,
in a word, yes, yeah, I do think that Herodotus is partly behind that.
I find all this really interesting because I think from the perspective of historiography, historians and how they construct the narratives in their histories, and I'm thinking in the 12th century, Stavros Niarchos, who's probably a person, a writer who you could easily describe as highly tragic. In the way that he constructs the super vibrant narratives of tragedies for crusade, and you have to wonder then how do you engage with types of history and philosophical stances in types of history, whether this is a critique of tragic history or maybe embracing of it, depending on what you want to do. And then for someone like Niarchos who needs to keep a memory of what's lost and understand how it was lost, reason is not enough. Emotion that would sustain a community and move it forward would force them away from a Platonic kind of reading.
Well, and we have to ask ourselves, right, whether reason would ever have been enough. Right? I mean, whether, in a sense, right, Plato's that Plato is perhaps not interested in popular history at all. He's more, he is, I mean, I suppose he would be interested in creating a kind of noble narrative that would be the received story. We could take, the Genaion Pseudos, right, the noble lie of the Republic, right? Once we've achieved our ideal state, we can create a kind of narrative that is going to enable everybody in that state to continue to feel fondly towards the state, supportive of other citizens, and they will all live a life of virtue. But I don't think that Plato would be a fan of historical investigation, right, such as we see going on in the laws. If it were exposed to a wider audience, I think he likes the seminar, but then for the broader audience, you would say, yes, what story about the past can we tell them that is going to get the effect that we want? But then I suppose it wouldn't be research, it wouldn't be philosophy anymore, it would be a kind of education.
I can't stop thinking of the notion of identity, that in many ways it's a project on identity, like historical imagination and how one relates to the past, also leading to future praxis as well. I wonder if you had any comments on that, where praxis fits in terms of, again, revisiting the past, historical imagination. It does bring in almost the burden of the past and having to act a certain way. So
I mean, I think that I've asked myself on several occasions why it is that in the Timaeus and in the laws, and to a certain extent in the Statesman as well, although I didn't talk about the Statesman today, Plato is so keen on a kind of cataclysmic view of history, whereby every so often civilization gets wiped out and you have to start with a tabula rasa. And in the laws passage that I talked about today, when he says, in the vast expanse of time, every single type of constitution that you can imagine must have come into existence, and it will either have had a successful trajectory or a failed trajectory. I wonder whether that's a way of trying to, right, make us detached from, right, ideological formations that would make us, right, yeah, identify with one particular past. I think this is what he's trying, one of the reasons he has, right, the Spartan, the Cretan, and the Athenian in the laws, because there's a lot of jockeying that goes on in the early books of the laws, where the Cretans say, well, in Crete we do it this way, and the Spartans say, well, of course, no, we have the ideal constitution. And we're meant to actually get beyond that. We're meant to get beyond polis identity so that we can yeah, construct a more virtuous state. Because once we identify ourselves with a certain kind of history, the history of Sparta, the constitution of Sparta, once we think that this is an ideal which we need to, say, impose on other people, we're going to be governed by amathia, right? We're not going to be trying to construct our states with the eye to virtue that we should have. So that you have to, certainly from the point of view of the historical project, you actually have to rise above polis identity.
Which is the success of Sparta compared to Argos and Messene, is in and of itself a failure of the Spartans to work with the others to sort this out in this reasoned way and construct that thing that is bigger than the city.
Well, so there's this marvelous, really, I mean, the law, people should do more with the laws. It is extremely long, but the opening pages of the laws are all about, well, they're about the reception of elegiac poetry, and they're about how poetry can express certain polis identities. So we have an extended discussion of Tyrtaeus and Sparta, and the initial discussion in the dialogue is trying to get the Spartan and the Cretan to realize that the Spartan ideal of civic excellence is misguided, right? Because it only concentrates on, right, military victory over other people, and it actually doesn't look to internal cohesion within the state in the way that you would want. And McGillis is resistant at first, and the Athenian stranger, who has no name, interestingly, has to work really hard to say no. You're tremendously successful, but we need to rise above that and say, okay, what we need to look at is not just the state that is militarily successful outside itself, but the one that can build some sort of internal cohesion so that you don't have, helot uprisings, however many times they happen. And so this, it seems to me then that the world of that dialogue is intensely aware of the drawbacks of polis identification, and it is interesting too that the dialogue starts out with this critique of Sparta, which the Spartan then accepts. When you have to consider that, I think for many people in the early 4th century, Plato and conservatives like him would simply have been labeled as, right, no, Laconian sympathizers, right? The people who walk through the agora with their long hair and their cauliflower ears, right? Because they affect, because they affect Spartan manners. So I think he's trying to distance himself from saying, no, you think that any kind of conservative political agenda is Spartan, right? No, that's not the case. We need to go beyond that.